The Sopwith 1.5 Strutter. To the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter belonged the distinction of being the first true two-seat fighter of tractor layout to see service. It was also the first Sopwith type to carry the unmistakable stamp of the design team that included R.J. Ashfield and Herbert Smith, and was, in its day, a remarkably advanced aircraft. The 1.5 Strutter was designed and built for the Admiralty. The prototype, number 3686, was passed by the Sopwith Experimental Department on the 12th of December, 1915. It was a handsome single-bay biplane, powered by a 110-horsepower Clerget 9Z rotary engine that ran on an overhung mounting. The airframe was conventionally built of wood, with wire cross bracing and fabric covering. The halves of the upper wing met at the center line. There was no upper center section, and were supported by the characteristic arrangement of struts from which the aircraft derived its nickname. The lower wings were attached to stub wings that incorporated air brakes, pivoted surfaces that moved upwards to present a flat surface to the airstream. An innovation of some significance was the adjustable tailplane. Its incidence could be varied in flight by a handwheel in the pilot's cockpit. This prototype was unarmed, but fortunately the 1.5 Strutter was completed at the time when successful British gun synchronizing mechanisms and the ingenious and efficient Scarf No. 2 ring mounting became available. The Vickers Challenger synchronizing gear was functioning in December 1915 and was quickly put into production for the RFC. The Scarf Dybowski gear was tested early in 1916 and was ordered in quantity for the Royal Naval Air Service. The first production contract for the 1.5 Strutter was placed by the Admiralty, and deliveries began in February 1916. The earliest aircraft had no fixed gun for the pilot, doubtless owing to the prevailing shortage of Vickers guns that did not begin to be eased until that February. And alternative mountings for the Lewis gun were fitted until scarf rings became available. A few aircraft, such as A377, had an adjustable cranked pillar mounting for the observer's gun. Others had the cumbersome Newport mounting. The official Admiralty designation for the aircraft was the Sopwith Type 9400. A single-seat bomber version of the 1.5 Strutter was built at the same time as the two-seater. Its Admiralty designation was Sopwith Type 9700. Some of these single-seat bombers were converted into two-seat fighters. By the end of April 1916, No. 5 Wing, Royal Naval Air Service, had one complete flight of the new Sopwith two-seaters, and deliveries from the Sopwith-built batches 9376 to 9425 and 9651 to 9750 grew steadily in volume. The War Office had ordered the type for the Royal Flying Corps, but had had to place its contracts with other manufacturers. The first 6 1.5 Strutters for the Royal Flying Corps, 5719 to 5721, and 7998 to 8000, were at Farnborough in the last week of April, but were apparently aircraft transferred from Royal Naval Air Service contracts. The first production aircraft, built by Ruston Proctor & Company, 7762, did not reach Farnborough until 20th July 1916. The first Vickers-built machine, A1054, was reported to be there 10 days later. The spring of 1916 was an anxious time for the Royal Flying Corps. An assessment of its needs to meet the demands of the Great Somme Offensive that was planned for 29th June 1916, subsequently postponed to the 1st of July, showed it to be critically short of aircraft. So urgent was the need for fighting aircraft that No. 70 Squadron, the first to be equipped with 1.5 Strutters, went to France flight by flight as each was brought up to strength. A flight on 24th of May, B flight on 29th of June, C on 30th of July. Its aircraft had been transferred from Royal Naval Air Service contracts, the first of 77 1.5 Strutters handed over by the Admiralty during the summer of 1916 in response to the urgent appeal for assistance for the Royal Flying Corps made by Major General Trenchard in May 1916. The ex-Royal Naval Air Service aircraft were renumbered, A377 to A386. Things did not apparently move with all the speed that the circumstances demanded, however. It is known that A380 to A385 were allocated to B Flight of No. 70 Squadron, which did not cross the Channel until the 29th of June. Yet at least the first 5 of these 6 1.5 Strutters were at Farnborough as early as the 6th of June. For several weeks, the Sopwiths of No. 70 Squadron gave a good account of themselves, their long range enabling them to penetrate far into enemy territory. But by the time No. 45 Squadron had arrived in France on the 15th of October, 1916, new German single-seaters, heavily armed, had been introduced. From the autumn of 1916 onwards, the 1.5 Strutter's effectiveness declined, and by the time No. 43 Squadron reached France on the 17th of January, 1917, the Sopwiths were outclassed, and their losses grew. Perhaps the 1.5 Strutter might have retained combat effectiveness longer if it had been more maneuverable. The Central Flying School report on the type stated, "Machine is rather heavy and slow on controls." Captain Norman Macmillan wrote, "We had to exert all our strength and skill to make them dive, for they were very stable and resisted any sudden change in flight attitude." It could not hope to match the agility of the new Albatross and Halberstadt single-seaters. The type was not finally superseded by the Camel until early October 1917, and the gallant two-seaters did much good work, obsolete though they were, through the battles of Arras, Messines, and Ypres. Later production 1.5 Strutters had the 130 horsepower Clerget engine. The Ross interrupter gear and the Sopwith copper synchronizing gear were fitted to the pilot's armament in some aircraft. In September 1916, a variant of the 1.5 Strutter, powered by the 150 horsepower Smith static engine, was designed. The Admiralty had become interested in the unusual 10-cylinder radial engine early in 1915 and conducted exhaustive tests on it. Possibly the modified 1.5 Strutter was intended to be the test bed for the Smith, but it is not known whether the installation was made. The loaded weight of the aircraft with fuel for 4 hours was expected to be 1,960 pounds. The RFC used 1.5 Strutters for home defense purposes in 1917. The type was flown by squadrons number 37, 44, and 78. 56 1.5 Strutter two-seaters and 3 single-seaters were allocated to home defense units. The latter may have been some of those aircraft of RFC contracts that were built without an observer's cockpit, and externally resembled the bomber form of the 1.5 Strutter. Several of the two-seaters were converted into single-seaters of an entirely different kind, in which the pilot occupied what would ordinarily have been the rear cockpit, and the front cockpit being fared over. This was a homemade development of the 1.5 Strutter, evolved by Captain F.W. Honett of No. 78 Squadron, where it was known as the Sopwith Comic. The armament of these home defense versions varied considerably. At least one, A6906, had originally had a single Vickers gun in the standard position above the nose. Later, in common with other Sopwith Comics of No. 78 Squadron, this aircraft had a single Lewis gun mounted centrally above the upper wing and firing forward over the air screw. When B762 was tested at Martlesham Heath, it had a pair of Lewis guns on a special mounting in front of the cockpit, firing upward. Royal Naval Air Service 1.5 Strutters were used as fighters and as bombers, and in the latter capacity had some considerable success. Only the Royal Naval Air Service used the 1.5 Strutter outside of the French theater of war. In the Aegean area, A, B, C, and D squadrons all had a few Sopwiths on their strength, and in March 1917, E and F squadrons had some 1.5 Strutters when they were formed. These aircraft did more bombing than fighting, however. The Royal Naval Air Service also used 1.5 Strutters as shipboard aircraft, but their function as reconnaissance and their history embodying many experiments with undercarriages and flotation gear will not be covered here. France, Belgium, and Russia used the 1.5 Strutter, and both versions of the design were produced on a very large scale in France. Some of the French-built aircrafts had 110 horsepower Leron 9J, 135 horsepower Leron 9JBY, 135 horsepower Clerget 9BA, 135 horsepower Clerget 9BB, or 145 horsepower Clerget 9BC as alternative engines. The two-seater 1.5 Strutter was manufactured in Russia by the Dux Company of Moscow and by V.A. Lebedev, Novaya Derevna, St. Petersburg. The first Lebedev contract, dated 1st July 1917, was for 50 Sopwiths. It was followed by a later order for 150 further aircraft. The Russian-built 1.5 Strutters had modified undercarriages of Russian design. Owing to a chronic lack of engines, few Russian-built 1.5 Strutters entered service. These Allied countries used the Sopwith primarily as reconnaissance or bomber aircraft, but it is of interest to record that the leading Belgian fighter pilot, Baron Coppens de Houthulust, flew the Man Egerton 1.5 Strutter N5240 while he was with the Belgian 4th Squadron. 5 of the 1.5 Strutters that came down in Dutch territory, including the first production aircraft, number 9376, were flown by the Dutch Luchtvaart Afdeling from 1917 onwards. A few specimens were flown by Romania and Japan. Possibly the last 1.5 Strutters in operational use were those flown for a short time between May and July of 1918, flown by the U.S. 88th, 90th, and 99th Aero Squadrons. The American Expeditionary Force had bought 514 1.5 Strutters from France in the spring of 1918, but most of them as trainers at Issoudun. At home, the 1.5 Strutter was flown at various experimental stations, including Biggin Hill, where 2 of the Sopwiths pioneered the use of air-to-air radio telephony. The type ended its service with training units, and a few were used by senior officers as personal aircraft. Notable among these was B-8912, which was used by Lieutenant Colonel R.R. Smith Barry, the creator and commanding officer of the School of Special Flying, Gosport. Once again, there are far too many photos of this airplane for me to use in this story, so here's some of the leftovers. And now here's my usual assorted montage.